This podcast discusses child sexual abuse and the impacts of harm on children and families. While we won't include graphic detail, some listeners may find this content distressing. Please take care while listening and consider pausing or seeking support if you need to. There's many and varied support services available, including Lifeline on 13 11 14, Kids Helpline for 5 to 25-year-olds on 1800 55 1800, and the Sexual Assault Helpline on 1800 010 120. If you're outside of Australia, we encourage you to seek a local support service. In this episode, I'll be joined by Mr. Bob Atkinson, AO-APM, former Queensland Police Commissioner and Commissioner on the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. As you listen, we invite you to hold two ideas at once: the seriousness of the harm that occurred and the possibility of change, if we're willing to see what has been in plain sight and act on it. This is Plain Sight. Let's begin.
One of the risks with reports is that, and the Royal Commission report was no different, is that I think people think, oh, we had a Royal Commission into that, and the problem's fixed. Yeah. And with the Child Abuse Royal Commission, nothing could have been further from the truth. It was limited to, quite rightly, in its terms of reference, to institutional child sexual abuse. And certainly this is a case of institutional child sexual abuse. But we know that most abuse is not institutional, it's familial. But my hope is that this work, and certainly the work of the Royal Commission, will transfer across as well to familial abuse. So there is very much still a long way to go with all of this. It's such an important topic,
Absolutely.
It really is. Yeah.
Before you arrived, we were talking here about all of the things that you have done. Former Police Commissioner, Commissioner of the Royal Commission. You've done so much work in child sexual abuse prevention. Are you Commissioner Atkinson? Are you Mr. Atkinson? Or are you Bob?
It's a very Queensland thing, isn't it? Yeah. Very much, Bob. Yeah.
I'm interested in your pin as well. What's that on your lapel?
Well, again, very grateful for that. But when I received this at the time, I said it was reflective of the work of the police department.
Okay.
So it's one of the four areas of the Order of Australia.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but I've been enormously privileged and fortunate to be able to do things that when I started my career at 20 years of age in the police department, but way back in 1968, that I never imagined would happen. But you never know, and I'm biased towards Queensland, of course, but it's a state of great opportunity, it really is.
Absolutely. When you look back at all of those things that you've done, what do you think? What are your thoughts?
Oh, just enormously privileged and grateful for the opportunity to have been part of these things. And like anything, like you are here at the QFCC, it's teamwork, and you get a good group of people together, and it's remarkable what they can achieve. It really is.
When you look back, do you see moments or milestones where things really did change, critical junctures?
Yeah, I think for Queenslanders, the decade of the 80s was the most significant time where our state changed. Primarily, that was the Fitzgerald Inquiry, which went from 1987 to 1989. But as well, there was the Commonwealth Games in 1982, Expo, a change of government. Would you believe we had one change of government in Queensland in, I think it was 72 or 74 years. The Labor Party were in power for 40 years, and then the Conservatives for 32, and the government changed after the Fitzgerald Inquiry in 1989. So for me, that decade, the decade of the 80s, was a really important decade for Queensland.
And you were really part of it, at the heart of it too.
A little bit of a role. Certainly, no, I won't anywhere near claim at the heart of it, but had the privilege of post-Fitzgerald being one of the people in the police department who had the responsibility for implementing the recommendations. And for the police, that was a seismic change. The organisation that was there pre-Fitzgerald, post-Fitzgerald were two totally different organisations.
Absolutely. Your experience in protecting children's safety is extraordinary. I don't have to tell you that. I'm sure you've had many people say it to you before. I'm really grateful that you're sharing your time and expertise with me today for this podcast. So thank you for being here.
Well, that's reciprocated. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the report. And I probably should say as well that anything I say is just my own personal opinion. It's not that necessarily of any other entity, So, but pleased to be here.
I'm going to ask you about the Royal Commission and about the system failures, but maybe before we get into that, maybe just talk us through the Royal Commission, how you got there and what your interest in participating in that was.
Yes, thanks. Well, I think Julia Gillard will be remembered for three things in particular. Firstly, the first woman to be the Prime Minister of Australia. Secondly, the misogyny speech. And thirdly, having the courage to announce and commit to the Royal Commission. And she did that in November 2012. You never know how life's going to unfold. I'd retired from the police department on the 30th of October 2012. And it sounds selfish, but it was time to go. But I really wasn't fully ready to retire. So about a week or two after she announced it, I got a call from the Attorney General's office in Canberra asking if I would be interested in a role with the Royal Commission that she'd announced, not knowing what that would be to be one of the 6 commissioners. So, of course, I said, yes, that would be good. Part of my background in the police was the CIB, what we used to be called the Juvenile Aid Bureau and is now called the Child Protection Investigation Unit. And I'd been a detective for 20 years, but in small places where you basically did everything, So, and I had a particular interest in this area. So, as you're aware, the Royal Commission started when the terms of reference were signed off by the Prime Minister and Governor-General in January 2013. Initially, it was intended to go for 3 years, but in the terms of reference, it said that we were to listen to the stories of people with lived experience and any recommendations they had. And we actually wondered at the start as to whether people would come forward, because many, if not most, of the people who were abused as children in an institutional context were failed by every level of authority. When they tried to report it, the criminal justice system, the organisation where they were abused, and a Royal Commission is another form of authority. But so many came forward that the term of the Royal Commission was extended from 3 to 5 years. And in the end, we saw just over 8,000 people in what were called private sessions. The chair of the Royal Commission, Peter McClellan, a New South Wales Supreme Court judge, saw at the outset that if we were going to do this, we needed to say to people, you can come and talk to us with complete privacy and confidentiality, and no one will know you've even seen us unless you want us to tell them. So he had the legislation, which unsurprisingly is called the Royal Commissions Act, amended to enable that to occur. Now, of course, for some people that was incredibly important. They didn't want anyone to know. They just wanted to be able to tell their story. For others, they'd been vocal and quite public, so it wasn't really an issue. One of the things that really struck me was the people who came forward for different reasons. In some cases, again, they'd never told anyone, and sadly, they just wanted to tell someone before they passed away, especially more elderly folk. But there was one common theme to every single one of them, and that was that they didn't want what had happened to them to happen to another child. And I just have enormous admiration for the courage of those people who would do that to achieve that goal, to prevent child sexual abuse in any context to the greatest extent possible.
Absolutely. Reflecting on that experience and all of the things that you heard through the Royal Commission and the findings, and then reflecting on In Plain Sight, what struck you the most about how familiar the system failings still are, despite years of reform and the things that did come out of the Royal Commission?
It's both disturbing and concerning that it's taken, it seems to take so much time. On the other hand, I guess societal change can take time and does take time. and even simple things like attitudes to drink driving and cigarette smoking. I mean, if this was back in the 70s in this room, there'd be cigarettes, ashtrays, and half the people would be smoking. And that was a no-brainer, really. So even that took time. So societal change does take time. But it's just so important that the momentum that was established, hopefully by the Royal Commission, and the momentum that will be established by this report is continued. And I think that some of those similarities to me were that, or are, that in an institutional context, what is so important is the environment in that institution and the culture that exists. And it would seem to me, again, from this inquiry, that there was obviously repeated offending over some 20 years, and that there must have been and was areas of concern. But what happened was that the culture of those childcare centres was such that in most cases people weren't able to or reluctant to say or do anything about it. And that's, I guess, reflective. One of the things that for me that came out of the Royal Commission was that there were three things that seemed to underpin what had happened, and particularly where there were more than concerns, where there was known child sexual abuse going on. And what happened was the offender was supported and moved somewhere else. That was particularly the case with clergy abuse in the churches. And the three things to me were protecting the reputation of the organisation, protecting colleagues, and protecting the financial resources of the organisation. Now, again, just my view, but arguably some of that underpinned, if not a lot of it, these circumstances where one can assume that there were people who maybe had concerns about actually Paul Griffiths, but because of the culture, perhaps because of the lack of training, lack of awareness, but the culture, that they didn't feel confident or safe enough to say something about it. And that's, to me, a very important thing. And institutions, organisations that care for children, need to have a culture there where people, if they have concerns, can report that, say something, do so confidentially, but also be protected in doing that. Be protected and supported. That to me underpins a lot of this. And I'm talking there not so much or not at all about matters where there is clear evidence of child sexual abuse. I'm talking about where there are concerns, suspicions, a sense of anxiety about a colleague. And so what can the person do? And if culture is such a powerful thing, it really is, in any organisation, and it just underpins how things unfold.
In Plain Sight highlights that there were many missed signs and missed warnings, and you have spoken about that from your experience in the Royal Commission as well. From your perspective, why do systems struggle to act and to respond when risks are identified?
Well, again, my view, I think there's a lot in this. Again, it comes back to the internal culture of the organisation. How people feel about their capacity to do something or say something. And the difficulty, I think, is this, that if the behaviour of a colleague is inappropriate or of concern, and if it's something like they come to work smelling of alcohol, they're late for work, they're a cigarette smoker and they're always outside having a cigarette. If it's something like that, that's pretty easy to address. It really is, for management to say and do something about that, or a colleague to say something about it. But and I'm not making excuses or saying that these things shouldn't be reported, but to infer that someone might be a child sex abuser is a very big call and a very serious one. We're which I think is a good thing, a very forgiving society. There's lots of evidence where people have committed crimes been convicted, sometimes go to prison. It could be for property theft, break and enters, even drug dealing, and we'll forgive those people and they can move on in their lives. But child sex abuse is unforgivable, as it should be. It's just in a whole separate category of its own. So the inference or allegation is a serious one, and that is why the person who has those concerns has to be supported and protected. And the culture of that, and it doesn't matter, it can be any organisation at all. It can be a for-profit childcare centre. It can be the sporting club at Longreach, where they're all volunteers, the cricket club or whatever. But the culture has to be such, and needs to be such, that if someone has concerns, there's something they can do about it, and they will be supported. They will be supported in doing something about it. And we've still got a way to go, I think, before we get there. And I don't think that's separate necessarily from familial abuse. In every family, there is a culture that family has. In some families, there is a culture of absolute distrust of the police and authority. So for a child in a family situation to say and do something, that might be almost impossible. And for someone who's concerned about it to say or do something. But again, I'm just so hopeful that the work of this report and the Royal Commission, and hopefully what will happen into the future, that abuse in an institutional context, regardless of the form of institution, will over time move across as well to familial abuse.
Do you think we take child sexual abuse seriously enough as a society?
I think that it's in the tough basket, and in some cases maybe in the just too hard basket, again because of the nature of it. And for the people that, many of the people that I saw in the Royal Commission, they were children in the 50s and 60s, which I grew up in that era as well. And it was an era where things were very different to how they are today. So I think that, again, it's just so serious that it's probably easy for people, or easier to say this is just too hard to deal with. And that's such a sad thing because it's just so important as well. And one of the points in this report that I think is particular, well, that all of the points and all the recommendations are absolutely important, but where in the report it talks about things being siloed and how we tend to look at something without looking at all of the broader circumstances and timeframes around it, and that's just so important as well. And of course another one is the intersection of the situation of child safety versus the criminal justice system, and for the police, the need to be able to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. And in terms of vulnerability, there are few children more vulnerable than children in a preschool childcare centre, some of whom will be non-verbal at a very young age, or children, young people who have an intellectual disability and might be non-verbal as well. You couldn't get more vulnerable children than those children, and we need to be particularly alert to that area of vulnerability.
You were an expert advisor to the review. You spoke about responsibility not in terms of blame but obligation. Can you talk to us a bit more about what shared responsibility for safeguarding children actually demands of leaders and institutions, and really beyond that compliance response or a policy response?
Yeah. No, I agree. It is, and it starts at the top, in my opinion. It starts with the leadership. And one of the things that came out of the Royal Commission was what we call the 10 child safe standards, and they were adopted nationally by every jurisdiction, renamed the 10 child safe principles. And it's unsurprising that the very first of those talks about leadership, culture and governance. And those three things, leadership, culture and governance, and they start at the top and they need to move down. And what's important as well is that the rhetoric matches the reality in the culture. So many people would have worked for an organisation, for example, where the principles of that organisation say, our people are our most important asset. But sometimes people will say, well, having worked for that organisation, that rhetoric that people are our most important asset didn't match the reality of the culture and what really happens. So then the leadership needs to drive that the most important thing in our organisation is the safety of the children we have responsibility for and care for, and that child sexual abuse is not something, as sometimes people say, oh yes, it's a problem, but not here. Never in our organisation would that be the case. That it can happen, and it's devastating, and so we need to be alert to it. And one of the things with, and this fellow Griffiths was an example, one of the things with perpetrators of child abuse is that they are, I mean, it's a terrible, terrible thing to be good at, but they are. They know how to groom not just the child necessarily, but the environment and their colleagues and the family as well. And they seem to have a radar to pick up on a vulnerable child as well. So that awareness of the dynamics of how this can be. And another aspect is that they will always seek an opportunity to be alone with the child, always, because they're not going to commit the offence in front of people. So just the awareness and the signs. One of the remarkable things I thought in the Royal Commission in the private session was young people who were being abused by priest or reverend, clergy, teacher, sports coach, and whose behaviour changed dramatically. It went from being a good student, good at sport, whatever, to being truant, misbehaving. And they were just written off as teenagers who'd gone bad. And no one ever said to them, hey, why is your behaviour changed? Why is something happened? And said that in a confidential way. And even with young children, very young children, that behavioural change can exist. And we need, I think, as well, in terms of the training and awareness in this space, to be mindful of how children can communicate. And my sense of it is this, that sometimes they will test the water. So say hypothetically, it's the sports coach. And everyone loves the sports coach and think he is just marvellous, and he's doing all this great work with kids. And they might say one day, oh, I really don't like Mr. Brown. So they're testing. And if the response is, oh, don't be silly, he's wonderful, then they won't go any further. But if someone would just get them aside and say, look, it's interesting what you said about Mr. Brown. Why is it that you don't like him? It's okay, just tell me what's happening here. And so there's so many aspects to this that we need to be aware of. That's got to be in the training, and forgive me if I'm being repetitive, but it's got to be that in that environment, it's important to say something if you have concerns. You'll be 100% supported. We'll be grateful to you, and you can do that and feel safe about your employment, and someone will do something about it. And I think we're still a long way short in some of these entities. I really do.
Queensland has the Child Safe Organisations Act, which includes the 10 child safe standards that you're talking about. It came into effect it was passed in 2024 and it's coming into effect from last year. Organisations right across Queensland who work with children are starting to implement the standards. What's your message to them, particularly those who may see this as an add-on or an administrative exercise or something that's complicating their business?
My message would be, for what it's worth, would simply be, this is one of the most important things you can ever do. And please don't think that it can't happen here. And regardless of what it is, in the institution that looks after children, whether it's the Scouts or sports or a school or a childcare centre or the Police Citizens Youth Club, whatever it is, that the number one priority is the safety of the children you have responsibility for. And again, if we can get this right, in an institutional context, then I believe and hope that that will translate across in the longer term to familial abuse, which sadly is the majority of abuse, It won't be a quick journey, but as long as we can maintain the momentum in that space, that's just so important. And yes, it may feel like an impost. And my sense of it, though, is that there's very much a common sense approach for this, so that organisations like private schools, for example, where people pay significant fees and children board, or childcare centres that are particularly for profit, that they would be expected to be the best practice example in terms of standards, and that if it is the cricket or football club at Longreach or Mount Isa, then there'd be a more sensible interpretation of how to support people, in terms of what you can do there, because they're almost always volunteers, those sporting organisations. What we don't want is people to say, oh, this is just too much. I don't want to continue to do this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In your contribution to In Plain Sight, you clearly articulate the history of Australia grappling to identify, name and respond to child sexual abuse. You've spoken a bit about that. Can you talk us about the history about that, and if you think we are advancing on the right journey, or from your perspective, do we have a long way to go?
Okay, I think the answer to that is both. I think we've come an enormously long way, but we still have a long way to go. And again, because of my age, I grew up in the 50s and 60s, so in the private sessions with the Royal Commission, when people talked about what it was like, I feel as though I can truly relate to that because I remember that time well. So some of the characteristics that existed then, which enabled these people to basically get away with what they were doing, were firstly that people in positions of authority were on pedestals in society, particularly the clergy. These people were God's representative on earth, And in the 50s and 60s, church attendance was at a very high level. So if the local minister, reverend or priest said something, then that's how it was. Children were seen and not heard. That was how it was. As well, children were regarded as being unreliable and creative in terms of what they would imagine. So that and another aspect too was that we didn't talk about things. In the 50s and 60s, in that era, domestic violence was regarded as private, personal, family business. Mental health was a taboo subject. It just wasn't talked about. And for something like child sexual abuse, it certainly, and there was no such thing as sex education for kids either, really. So, but there were just no words for child sexual abuse. That just was in the outer space. That just wasn't. And all of those things enable perpetrators to get away with what they did or contributed towards it. So if you look at those things now, we've come a long way. We just don't have blind trust in people in positions of authority anymore, and that's not a bad thing. We should have the right to be aware and question. We do talk about things now, domestic violence and mental health and child sexual abuse. We do talk about those things now, and we recognise now that if a child makes a complaint, that's very, very unlikely to not be true and correct circumstance. So we've improved there. But there is just so much more that needs to be done. One of the things we saw early in the term of the Royal Commission was the need for a national Working with Children's Check scheme. And that was one of the 3 early reports that we did. We did that report in 2015. I think one of the problems we have in Australia, and problems is maybe an unfair word, but we have the federal government, we have the 6 states and the 2 territories. So for working with children's check schemes, there's 8 different schemes in Australia. And it just seems to be difficult at times to get everyone to agree. and have a national scheme. But sadly, this and other recent events in New South Wales and Victoria hopefully will be the catalyst towards the momentum. My understanding is from the media that there's a move to have a more national scheme in relation to childcare centres, but that needs to be rolled out across the entire country, and that's one, of course, of the recommendations of this report.
Finally, the Royal Commission made more than 400 recommendations. In Plain Sight recommends 28. How do you see these recommendations working with those of the Royal Commission?
Well, I think they blend together quite accurately, and all I can say is that I fully endorse this report and the recommendations in it. They're critical not just for Queensland but nationally as well. In the last report the Royal Commission did in 17 volumes, there were 3 as we went along and then 17 volumes that were handed over to the Governor-General, and the Royal Commission concluded on the 15th of December 2017. And the last volume, volume 17 of that, was titled Beyond the Royal Commission, and one of the recommendations in that report was that after 10 years, which will be December 2027, there'll be a full review of the recommendations of the Royal Commission and the status of abuse in our country. To me, it's terribly important that happen, and hopefully this report will be a catalyst for the momentum towards seeing that happen. And again, just so important. I know there's lots of important issues, cost of living, climate change, well, currently even terrorism, absolutely. But this is, to me, up with the most important of all. And if as a country we can't protect our children, then we really have failed. And child sexual abuse is a terrible, terrible thing. Apart from the criminality, it's like a cruel robbery. But what it does is it doesn't steal from the child money or valuables, but what it steals from the child is their safety, their trust, their confidence, their sense of well-being, and for many, their future potential. So we need collectively to do all we can to prevent this to the greatest extent possible, and if we have suspicions that it might be occurring, to do something about it.
Commissioner Bob Atkinson, thank you so much for joining me. I've really, really appreciated our time together.
Thank you, it's been a privilege.
What In Plain Sight makes clear is that child sexual abuse does not happen in isolation. It happens when systems fail to see, fail to listen, and fail to act, even when the warning signs are there. And it reminds us that safeguarding children is not the responsibility of one agency or one profession. It belongs to all of us. This first episode has laid the foundation, grounding us in the importance of childhood and in the reality that systems must be designed around the needs of children, not the other way around. In the next episode, we will move closer to lived experience, to the voices of children and families, and to what their experiences reveal about the blind spots in our systems. If we are serious about preventing harm, we must be willing to listen, to learn, and to change. This is In Plain Sight. Thank you for listening.